Next thing we need to go into is discuss how we go about giving our images shape and texture and depth. And what we're really talking about here is shadows. Cinematography has been described as the art of placing shadows. And if you think about it, that's really kind of true. Let's look at the example of if you're drawing a sketch, a white sheet of paper. You got a whole bunch of light there, right? And what do you do with your pencil? You go in and add the dark. You're adding the shadows, and that's what really shapes that paper into looking like the image you want. Light's the same way. You have a brightly lit subject, there's no definition or depth. It's the shadows that bring that out. Let's go back to our opening sketch, where we had that shot where we showed the monster and it was brightly lit up. No shadows, no artistry, no mood, no good, right? But the second shot we showed, we had placed a lot of shadows. There was a lot of mystery in there, and that really brought home the effect. That's what a lot of lighting is about. If that's the kind of image that you're looking for, you need to know how to place the shadows, how many shadows to place, and where to place them to get the image to convey the mood you're looking for. And what is a shadow? I mean, sometimes we think about the idea of a light source casting a shadow, and that's really kind of completely inaccurate. You don't ever cast a shadow. All you do is light up areas other than where the shadow is. And it's kind of important to understand that, because that gives you power in controlling the shadows. Now, first of all, we think of the shadow as being the darkest area or the dark areas of a scene. We have to factor in that dark is relative. The way that the shadow is perceived by us is by its relative darkness in relation to the brighter areas in the scene. There's still light there. So if we have a situation where we shine a light on somebody's face and we say that it is now casting a shadow, well, that shadow was always there. If we turn that key light off of them, we can see that their face didn't just suddenly get darker, and it certainly didn't get lighter. It's not like their side of the face got darker when we turned this light on and this shadow showed up. It just points out to us that, oh, now there's a difference in brightness between the now lit up side and the side that wasn't previously lit up. So knowing that a shadow is only darker than the surrounding area, now we can control the lightness of that shadow. We can actually shine light into a shadow, and as long as we don't bring it up so high that it's matching the bright areas, it's still a shadow. It's just not as dark of a shadow, and that can come in very handy. Sometimes you want really dark shadows. Sometimes you're going for an extreme dramatic film noir or something like that, and you want those rich, deep shadows, or a horror film or something like that. But sometimes you want very soft and gentle shadows. So when you talk about controlling the light ratio and the ratio of brightness to darkness in the shadows, now you have the ability to understand that you really are lighting up the shadow side. Shining a light in a shadow doesn't necessarily make the shadow disappear. It just makes that shadow lighter. It could make it disappear. If you shine one light on a face and no light on the other side whatsoever, let's say you put a hard light on one side and no light on the other, then yeah, you're going to have deep shadows on that unlit side of the face. And then if you put the exact same light, take two lights, so you leave the one that's there and you put the exact same light on the other side and shine it in, all of a sudden there's going to be no shadows whatsoever, because you're going to be equally lit on the face. The problem with that is it's pretty lame looking. It's very flat. That's what we call flat lighting. That's the kind of look you get from flash photography when somebody takes a portrait and they've got the flash on the camera and it just lights up the entire face evenly. It's not what we're normally going for. What we're always trying to do in cinematography is place the shadows where we want them to be in order to further the story. The deeper the shadows, the more prevalent the shadows, the darker the story is. The fewer the shadows that you have, the lighter the story is. So when we're doing a sitcom or a comedy, we usually kind of try to chase all the shadows out of there. You might have a whole bank of soft lights shining from all angles. You know, on a sitcom or something like that, there might not really be many shadows whatsoever. But when we go the other way and we start talking about a horror film, now we're usually dealing with one light source, or what ends up looking like one light source, casting a lot of shadows. And when I say casting, I'm using the general vernacular. What I mean is leaving shadows behind. Shadows add depth and they add drama. They're an important key to lighting, and if you understand how they work, where they come from, and how to eliminate them, you're empowered to get the kind of look you're looking for. When we're talking about shadow, Another concept we want to bring up is what we call the contrast ratio. And that contrast ratio is the ratio of light on each side of the face, on each lit side. So right now, in this particular example, I'm pretty much at 1:1 here. I have her lit up pretty much equally on both sides. But if we bring one side down substantially, now you can see there's a noticeable difference between the lit up side of her face and the shadowed side of her face. And so that might be a contrast ratio of 2:1, 3:1. I don't know exactly what this ratio is because I'm using a variable dimmer here. But directors of photography will talk about, when they ask the gaffer how to use this, they'll say, give me a 2:1 or give me a 3:1 on this person. And you'll grow, as you experiment with this, you'll grow to know what those mean and how much shadow we're talking about. An 8:1 would be a pretty serious shadow. We're talking about the lit up side being 8 times stronger than the shadowed side. So we might be looking at an 8:1 at something like that. And this is, again, I'm just using a dimmer, so I don't know exactly what the ratio is. I'm giving you ballparks here. But experiment with it, put different strength lights, and learn what those ratios are so that you can communicate effectively on a professional crew if you're dealing with somebody who knows what the contrast ratios are, and you can say simply, okay, I want a romantic scene here, so I want everybody lit at a 2:1. You tell people to do that, and they run around with their light meter and set the various lights, and maybe you're the guy running around with the light meter setting the various lights, and so then if you had to create a 2:1, you'd want a light that was half as strong on one side as on the other, assuming you had equally powerful fixtures, maybe the same fixture. I've got 2 identical 250-watt fixtures. So maybe if I wanted to create a 2:1 ratio, I would put the one light in one position and move the second light, again, as we talked earlier, 40% further away, and that would cut the amount of light in half, and then I would have a 2:1 ratio. If I want a 4:1 ratio, I would move that light twice as far, because the inverse square rule tells us that you double the distance and it cuts the strength of the light to 1/4. Once you get used to that concept and you realize what kind of look you're trying to create, then you'll know what the contrast ratio should be and can effectively communicate that. Maybe you're reading an interview from someone in American Cinematographer magazine or a website or somewhere, and they're describing how they lit a movie, and they said, yeah, in this scene I used a 4:1 contrast ratio. Well, now you know what that means, and you know how to go and recreate that look in your own films. With the light meter here, this is actually a 3-in-1 meter. You've got the disc up here, and this is where it senses the available light that's coming in. And then you've got, of course, your LCD readout, and then your buttons that you control things with. If I wanted to use it as just an incident meter, measuring the amount of light falling on the scene overall, then we have the white disc sticking up like this, and it will measure 180 degrees. So I take a reading on there, and it tells me, in general, yeah, I should have 1.4 would be my exposure for this scene at the ISO that I've got. But I can also use this particular meter to not read 180 degrees. This one here now, in this position, I've brought the disc back in, and so now it's only going to be able to read the light from one side. So now I could use it in this configuration. I can read the light that's coming from a certain direction, and I can find out, what my exact contrast ratio is. So I could, put the light up over here, and it will hit only the light here and ignore this, and that tells me I'm getting 1.0. And over here on this side, that's a 4.0. So we have about a 4-stop ratio between the key and the fill side here. And in this configuration, I can actually determine what that ratio is. And this can be very handy for, if someone's trying to pre-light a scene and they don't want to wait for the camera to come in or be dependent on the camera sitting there, they can run around with the light meter and set and fill in, rough in the lights the way that they think that they should be. And then we can fine tune it once we get the camera up and we start looking at the waveform monitor or at the zebras or something. We can fine tune the image, but we can get it roughed in really quickly. Shadow placement is one of the keys of understanding this art of lighting. So a lot of times what we'll end up with is you're stuck in an apartment and you're shooting against a white wall, and so you got 2 people sitting on a couch and you blast the lights at them and you get this ugly shadow behind them. It doesn't look like anything you'd see in a Hollywood production because you got this big overwhelming shadow. Who wants that? Nobody wants that. So how do you get rid of that? You don't necessarily go and try to chase that shadow with more light. That's just a losing proposition, because that shadow comes into play as you shine on the subject. It's going to light up the subject, and it's going to light up the wall behind them, except for this area. That's the area that's left in shadow, right? So if you try to come in with another light and fill in that shadow, maybe you'll fill in that shadow, but it will also fill in the light, the wall. It'll spill over, and it'll still look like a shadow behind there because now the surrounding wall is lighter. So perpetually chasing the shadow is an exercise in frustration. What you want to do instead is understand that no matter what light source you shine, there's going to be some shadow left over because the light is not going to only hit your subject. If you're lighting up a person or something, there's going to be some spill light to go past them, and it's going to hit the surrounding walls or whatever's behind them, and that's going to cause a shadow. So what we want to do at that point is move the light source to wherever the shadow is off camera. And that's not the hardest thing in the world to do. When you're dealing with that situation where you got the two people sitting on the couch and you got those ugly shadows, let's move that light source to where it's coming on the side, and the shadow will be cast outside of the frame. And that's a so much easier way to deal with the problem than trying to chase that shadow and eliminate it. Understand where the shadows are going to go, understand where they come from, and learn how to deal with them, and you'll be well on your way to mastering the art of lighting. All right, now let's talk a little bit more about how light works, because this is crucial. This you have to understand. Once you get this, then you understand how light works, you'll be able to control it and make it do what you want. Light pretty much moves in a straight line, moves in rays, and when it encounters something, it stops. It bounces off, and no light will be cast beyond there. That's where the shadow comes from. So when we're talking about the kinds of light sources, when we refer to a hard light or a soft light, we're really talking about the way that that shadow looks. A hard light will cast a very hard, sharp shadow. With a soft light, it'll have a smoother, gradual fall off. It won't be, black and white like a hard light would be. And then we should point that out. Hard and soft, that's relative. You can say the light is harder than another light or softer than another light, but it's kind of hard to get truly hard and truly soft, and I'll talk about that when we talk about how you make a hard light softer or how you make a soft light harder. Now, why does a hard light cast that kind of a shadow? Because a hard light, in that situation, pretty much the light that's being cast is traveling all in parallel. You're coming from one little tiny light source and traveling forward, and everybody is on the same path. It's all going in one direction. So when it hits an object, like a hand or whatever, some of the light hits here and lights up. The rest of it keeps going. So you have this very sharp, discrete transition from light to dark. Hard light, it's important to understand that light leaves that hard shadow. Now, you can get that hard light from a number of different sources. Typically, a hard light is going to come from a small light source. If we look at a tungsten lamp, light bulb, that's a hard source. And when you look inside that light, it's just that little tiny bit that's lighting up. All the rays of light that are coming off of that are coming from that one central point. So everything that hits any certain subject has got to be traveling pretty parallel, right? The hardest light source in the galaxy is the sun. And the sun, when we see it here on Earth, it's a little tiny source because it's 93 million miles away. So the light rays that hit us from the sun all have to be traveling pretty parallel to get there. So that parallel nature of the light traveling is one key component to why a light source that casts hard shadows casts those hard shadows. But let's talk about soft light for a second. Soft light leaves soft shadows. It's not that the light itself is any different. It's still traveling in these rays, but a soft light source is typically a bigger light source, and it's usually a diffused light source. So there's not a clear path for the light rays directly from the source to your subject. Instead, there's usually some manner of diffusion. This could be a softbox. It could be a fluorescent light, because the fluorescent light, the gases that it travels through, whatever. The net point to understand here is that the light isn't coming perfectly parallel. It's coming at you from all sorts of different directions. And this is what gives it the ability to wrap around the subject. It's a very flattering light. When you're trying to do beauty or portrait photography, you're going to want to use soft lights to illuminate your subject because they wrap around. And the other thing they do is they fill in all the little gaps and all the little, crow's feet and wrinkles and things like that. The soft light, because it comes from numerous directions instead of just one direction, it can go in and fill in the gaps and the valleys that a hard light leaves. So if you want to really accentuate somebody's wrinkles, a hard light's a good way to do that because it will leave those shadows completely unilluminated. It'll leave the valleys and the gaps and the cracks completely unilluminated, and there'll be deep, dark lines in there. Whereas a soft light, because it comes from all directions and it wraps around and it fills in those things, will make them less noticeable. You won't see these stark lines of darkness that a hard light would leave. Now, another key distinction between hard light and soft light is something that we call throw or fall off. A hard light, that has distance. A hard light can travel. You can light up a house across the street. You could light up, depending on the hard light that you got, you could light up a house way down the street. Soft light, that's not going to happen. Soft light has a very limited distance of where it has any usefulness. It has very quick fall off, is what we call it. Now, the reason why, if you think about it, let's say you'd put a hard light and a soft light right next to each other, and they're illuminating this wall. The hard light, because it's traveling primarily parallel, it's only going to light up a little bit of that wall, and it's going to light that little bit up very brightly, because all its energy is contained in this parallel beam. Whereas the soft light is going to light up everything. It's spraying light rays everywhere. Light's going here, it's going here, it's going here. It's not focused, and so it's not got that oomph. So the actual amount of lighting up that soft light will do is much less, but it's spread over a bigger area. Now, if we look at casting that light over distance, let's say we back those lights up. Let's say we double the distance. Each one of them is going to now be spraying its light over 4 times as much surface area. So if the hard light was spreading its energy over 1 square foot, and we double the distance, now it's spreading its energy over 4 square foot. Well, the soft light was spreading what energy it had over 50 square feet. It's going everywhere. If we now double that, now it's got to try to expand or stretch that same energy to cover 4 times the area, 200 square feet. Very little light is going to be getting through. So it disappears quickly. Now, where this can come into real play is if you're trying to light a scene and you're getting bounce light everywhere. Because the hard lights, when they spray their light, it's going to hit your subject and it's going to keep going. And it's going to bounce off the wall, and it's going to fill in the shadows, and it's going to light up this guy, and it's going to light up that guy. Hard light keeps going and going and going until you soak it up with a black card, or you bounce it off to somewhere where it's not necessary. Now, soft light, it sprays everywhere, but the fall off is pretty handy, because if you put a nice, weak soft light right up next to somebody, you might get a good lighting up of them, but by the time it hits the background, it's petered out. It's got no throw. It's got no distance. It's dissipated. So one characteristic of a hard light is a small light source. Characteristic of a soft light is a large light source. The larger the source, the softer the light will be. The smaller the source, the harder the light will be. Now that you know that, you can see some ways that maybe you can turn a hard light into a soft light. For example, let's hang a sheet of diffusion in front of it. A sheet of diffusion, instead of the light being this small parallel beam, once it hits that diffusion, it scatters. And the diffusion helps to create a larger size source for the light. At this point, when you're using diffusion gel on there, the light source itself isn't truly what's shining on your subject. What's the light source at this point is this glowing piece of diffusion. Okay, so you've transitioned the light source from being a little tiny pinpoint to being this great big sheet. Another way to turn a hard light soft is to put a softbox on it. Softbox is basically a built-in sheet of diffusion, but now you're turning a little tiny pinpoint of light into maybe a 2 foot by 2 foot large square of light. And when the light hits that diffusion, it's going to bounce in all sorts of different directions. So this gives it the ability to wrap around your subject. We're not just going to hit it hard and straight. We're going to come around at it from different angles. And that's something that you have to keep in mind. You can't just put a little 2-inch by 2-inch softbox on a small light and say, you know, Shazam, here's a soft light. It'll be softer than it was, but in comparison to a 2 foot by 2 foot softbox, that little thing is going to be a very hard light. The size of the source is important in this factor because the larger the source is, the more angles that the light beams can come at the subject and fill in those shadows and wrap around the subject. The smaller the source is, the more directional the light is going to be and the harder that light is. Another way to soften up a hard light is to move the light source closer to the subject because you're changing the relative size. The closer it gets, in proportion, the bigger it'll be. And sometimes we might think that, you know, if we take a big, harsh light and we put it too close to a subject, we're going to make it too hard. That's actually the opposite of what happens. If you have that big, hard light, the closer you can get it to somebody, the more chance you have of it softening up what the light is. There's a lot of ways that you can make hard light softer. Another way you can do it is to bounce it. If you bounce a purely parallel hard light source off of a white card, foam core, a white wall, the ceiling, whatever, when that light hits that surface, it's going to scatter. And the net result is just like as if you'd shown it through diffusion. Now, if you bounce that light into a mirror, it won't scatter. That can be very handy. If you need sunlight in a place where the sun isn't shining, a mirror board can reflect that sunlight and get it to where you need, and you can even bounce sunlight off of multiple mirrors. If you need it to go around a house or something, you can set 2 mirrors up and bring it in through a window when it's nowhere near there. Because a mirror, perfectly polished, there's no diffusion. What hits that bounces immediately out in still that same parallel motion. But a whiteboard, that scatters the light, and that softens the light. So you could have a hard light that you bounce into a white card, and that becomes a soft light. Now a soft source, as we mentioned how to soften up, the soft source is scattering light everywhere. It's a lot more difficult to turn a soft source hard, but there are a few things that you can do. For example, you can use egg crate. Egg crate, when it's placed in front of a soft light source, it blocks some of that scattering light and kind of corrals in to let only the more parallel light through. Now, it's not going to be a truly hard light by the time you put this egg crate on there because it's still a very big source, but it will be harder, it'll be crisper than if you just used a straight up softbox. Another way to harden up a soft light is to move it further away because you're making the size of the source smaller. The smaller the light source is, the more parallel the beams will be because it can't wrap around. It's too small. A great big light source can wrap around your subject from all sorts of different angles and fill in the darkness, which gives you softer shadows. But that parallel light coming from a long way away, that can only go in the one direction and it can't wrap around. So if you move a soft source further away, it will get harder. There are limits as to how far you can move a soft source, of course. Both lights are going to be subject to the inverse square rule. They're both going to lose intensity as you move them away in a ratio of, as you double the distance, it's 1/4 as intense. But the hard light starts with so much more intensity in the beginning that it carries that through longer and longer, whereas the soft light will dissipate into nothingness a lot sooner. Yes, it'll get harder, but it gets so much weaker so quickly that it's not really a practical solution. So this is a reason why it's not so easy to make a soft light harder. You can take a hard light as hard as you want. You could get a focused parabolic reflector light, a PAR, and you can put a softbox in front of that and make a good soft light out of that. That's great. But a soft light, as you try to make that hard, you can really only corral it with the egg crate or move it further away. Either way, you're going to be losing a lot of light output. Now, when we're talking about building a light kit, obviously you definitely need both. You want hard light and you want soft light. If you can't afford both, starting out with just hard lights is probably the better idea because it's much easier and more practical to make hard lights soft than it is to harden up a soft light.